The desert stretched endlessly, as if the earth itself had forgotten where it was supposed to end. Sunlight bled across the sky in shades of brass and copper, pressing down with a weight so heavy it felt like even time had slowed. Calder Wyatt rode into that silence, a lone figure against the vast New Mexico wilderness, his shadow stretching long and thin across the ground. His horse, Abraham, snorted beneath him, ears twitching at every rustle of dry sagebrush, while Calder adjusted the brim of his worn hat to shield his eyes from the merciless glare. There was nothing unusual about the day, not at first. He had tracked strays many times before, wandering cattle that tested his patience and stole his hours. The rhythm of hoofbeats and the creak of leather reins was familiar, almost comforting, like the slow heartbeat of survival. But beneath that rhythm pulsed something else, a quiet tension, a whisper carried by the desert wind. Abraham felt it too, pausing now and then, nostrils flaring, body taut. Calder trusted the instincts of his horse more than he trusted most men, and the unease was enough to put him on guard. The land around him was harsh but breathtaking, filled with jagged mesas and bleached trunks of trees long dead under the relentless sun. Every rock seemed to hold a story, every gust of wind a memory of battles fought and lives lost. Calder had lived in this wilderness long enough to know it was not empty. It was alive with secrets. Some of those secrets could save a man, others could destroy him. That was when he saw it. At first it seemed like a trick of the light, a shadow caught strangely against the twisted skeleton of a cottonwood tree. He narrowed his eyes, his chest tightening, a storm beginning to rise in the stillness of his thoughts. The closer he rode, the more that shadow sharpened into form. And then his breath caught. It was not a trick. Hanging from the gnarled branches was a figure, frail, suspended, bound by ropes that bit cruelly into flesh. For one unbearable instant, Calder thought it was nothing but a corpse, left as a warning to anyone passing through. Yet as Abraham snorted and pawed the earth, the figure stirred ever so slightly, a shudder of fabric in the scorching air. Calder's pulse thundered in his ears. Whoever it was, they were alive. Barely. He spurred Abraham forward, dust kicking up in desperate clouds around him. His boots hit the ground before the horse had fully stopped, and he moved with urgency, the crunch of gravel loud under his weight. Up close, the truth struck harder. It was a young woman, her skin scorched by the sun, her dark hair tangled and wild, her wrists rubbed raw from the merciless bite of rope. Around her neck hung a wooden sign carved with cruel words, blood dried into the grooves. A message, a threat. Calder's breath grew heavy as he stared, anger and sorrow colliding within him. He had seen justice twisted on the frontier before, men strung up for theft, revenge, or nothing at all. But this was different. This was no trial. This was punishment designed not just to kill, but to humiliate, to erase. And yet, against all odds, she clung to life. Her chest rose and fell with shallow effort, her head hanging limp until, as if sensing his presence, she lifted it just enough for their eyes to meet. In that moment, something unexplainable passed between them. Her gaze was fever-bright, filled with exhaustion and suffering, but beneath the pain burned defiance, raw and fierce. She should have been fading, her spirit broken by hours beneath the merciless sky, yet there was no surrender in those eyes. Calder felt the impact like a blow, a spark cutting through the hardened layers of his heart. It had been years since he had let himself feel anything but duty and survival, but this woman's stare awakened something he had long thought buried. Her lips parted, dry and cracked, her voice a whisper carried on the trembling air. "Please." That single word, fragile, almost lost in the desert silence, was enough to bind him to her fate. He could have turned away. Many would have. It was safer not to intervene, safer to let the desert claim her and keep his own life free of entanglement. But Calder Wyatt was not made for indifference. Somewhere deep inside him, something had always resisted the coldness the world tried to press into him, and now, looking at this broken stranger, he knew there was no choice at all. The knife slid easily into his calloused hand, blade catching the hard sunlight as he reached upward to saw at the rope. "This will hurt," he murmured, though he wasn't sure she heard. The first rope gave with a snap, her arm dropping like a dead weight, pulling a cry of pain from her throat. He grimaced, working faster, steadying himself to catch her as the final strands gave way. When she fell into his arms, she felt impossibly light, like a bird too long starved of flight. Fever burned through her skin, her breath shallow and uneven, but alive nonetheless. Calder cradled her carefully, his jaw set, his heart hammering with something that felt dangerously like hope. He looked once more at the sign that had mocked her suffering. "White man, don't forgive," it had proclaimed, etched in cruelty and hate. Calder ripped it from her neck and hurled it aside, the wood clattering uselessly against stone. He would burn it later, erase its venom in fire. For now, there was only the fragile rhythm of her breath against him, and the knowledge that he had stepped into something far larger than himself. The desert seemed to hold its breath as he lifted her onto Abraham's back, positioning her as gently as he could, though every movement made her flinch in pain. He whispered reassurances he wasn't sure she could hear, but the words came anyway, words meant to soothe, to heal, to remind her she was no longer alone. The journey back to his ranch would be long and grueling, but Calder no longer felt the weight of solitude pressing in on him. Instead, there was a strange warmth in his chest, as though saving her had unlocked a door he hadn't known existed. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain from far-off mountains, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, a sound wild, untamed, and strangely fitting. Calder tightened his grip on the reins, leading Abraham slowly toward home. He did not know who she was, why she had been left to die, or what storm might follow because of his choice. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: mercy mattered more than fear. And perhaps, in saving her, he might discover the fragments of his own heart still capable of love. The desert faded into twilight as he walked beside his horse, the girl's fragile form draped across the saddle, each step taking them closer to something neither of them could yet name. He felt it, though, a shift in the air, a promise that whatever path lay ahead would change everything. And if you've felt the stir of this story in your own heart, if it has reminded you that even in the harshest places love can bloom like wildflowers after rain, I invite you to stay with me. Like, share, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to walk further into this healing journey. Every gesture of support is a spark of warmth that keeps these stories alive, helping them reach souls who need a little light. Calder glanced once more at the woman he had pulled from death's grasp, her breath steadying just enough to remind him she was fighting still. The night gathered around them like a cloak, and he knew this was not the end, only the beginning. What started as a rescue would soon become a story of survival, trust, and love rising like dawn over the desert. And so, as the horizon burned with fading firelight, their journey together truly began, step by step, toward a future waiting just beyond the shadows. The adobe house rose from the desert like a stubborn survivor, its walls holding the warmth of the day and the promise of shelter against the chill of night. Calder pushed the heavy wooden door open with his shoulder, the girl still in his arms, her weight barely more than a bundle of dry sticks. The dim interior, lit only by the dying glow of sunset filtering through a single square window, felt like a sanctuary after the merciless glare outside. He laid her on his bed, simple, narrow, the rope frame creaking beneath her slight body. For a moment he stood over her, his chest rising and falling, the echo of his choice still loud in his ears. Her wrists bore angry welts where the rope had torn skin, raw edges that spoke of cruelty without need of words. Her lips were cracked, her breath shallow, fever radiating off her skin in waves. Calder filled a basin with well water drawn that morning, dipping clean rags into the tepid coolness. His hands, calloused and rough from years of ranch work, moved as gently as if he were tending a fragile bird. Each touch, each careful press of damp cloth against sunburned skin felt like an act of defiance against the violence she had endured. She stirred, a soft moan escaping her, her lashes fluttering like shadows against her cheeks. Calder leaned closer, his voice quiet, steady. "You're safe now. You're inside. No one will harm you here." She opened her eyes, dark and wide, scanning the room with alarm, before settling on his face. For an instant, he saw suspicion, fear, the instinct of someone too often betrayed. But then something shifted, some recognition that his presence carried no cruelty. Her breathing steadied a fraction, and she let her gaze linger on him as though weighing whether or not to trust. He returned to her wrists, dabbing gently at the torn flesh. "This will sting," he murmured, though she gave no sign of understanding his words. When she flinched, he paused, waiting until the tightness in her shoulders eased before continuing. Patience, he reminded himself, was another form of healing. Once her wounds were cleaned, he fetched willow bark tea from the small shelf of herbs his mother had taught him to keep. He had never been much for remedies beyond whiskey and grit, but tonight he brewed carefully, steeping the bark until the water turned pale brown. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he lifted her gently and held the cup to her lips. At first she turned away, suspicion flashing again in her eyes, but hunger and thirst overcame fear. Slowly she accepted, her hands trembling as she guided the rim. Calder steadied her, his palm warm against the curve of her back. When she finished, she sagged back against the pillow, exhaustion claiming her once more. Calder studied her in the quiet, the way her hair spilled across his blanket like a dark river, the fever glow softening her features. She was young, far too young to have faced such cruelty, and yet her expression, even in sleep, carried a strength that stirred something deep within him. He could almost hear his sister Helena's voice, long gone, but etched in memory. "Don't harden your heart, Cal. Even the desert blooms when it rains." Night gathered. Crickets sang outside, an owl hooted across the valley, and the adobe walls sighed with the cooling air. Calder spread his bedroll by the stove, giving her the bed without hesitation. Before blowing out the lantern, he checked the revolver hanging by the door, his old instinct reminding him that cruelty was rarely finished with one attempt. Then he lay down on the floor, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, a fragile song against the hush of the desert. Sometime in the dark hours she whimpered in her sleep, not the sound of fever, but of nightmares clawing through her mind. Calder pushed himself up on one elbow, watching her twist beneath the blanket. His hand twitched toward her, aching to offer comfort. But he held back. Too soon, he thought. Too much fear already burned into her. Instead, he whispered softly into the stillness, words of no great poetry, just steady reassurance. You're safe. You're not alone anymore. Rest, that's all you need to do now. His voice threaded through the night until her breathing calmed again, and only then did he let sleep claim him too. Dawn broke with the smell of sage carried on a cool breeze. Calder rose stiff from the floor, stretching the ache from his back. He stoked the fire, setting beans to simmer, the small rituals of morning grounding him. When he glanced at the bed, he found her awake, propped weakly against the wall, watching him. Those dark eyes were sharp now, wary, yet filled with questions she could not, or would not, speak aloud. You're stronger today, he said simply, turning the beans with a wooden spoon. Food will help more than words. He carried a plate to her, setting it within reach before stepping back, careful not to crowd her. She hesitated, her gaze flicking from him to the food, and then slowly reached for it. Each motion was deliberate, as though relearning what it meant to eat, to live. Calder took his own plate to the chair by the window, giving her space. They ate in silence, but it was a silence not of emptiness, rather of cautious peace. He found himself speaking softly, sharing fragments of his own story without expecting reply. I came west from Missouri. Thought I'd try my hand at cattle ranching. Turns out cows are stubborn as people, maybe more. Lost most of what I had one hard winter. But this place... He glanced around at the humble room, the beams overhead, the walls scarred by years. This place is still mine, bought and paid for with sweat. Feels like something worth holding on to. She listened, though her expression gave nothing away. When he said her name, Lena, he tried softly, the name borrowed from his sister. Her eyes flicked up sharply, as if the sound startled her. Just a name until you're ready to share your own, he explained gently. She said nothing, but the tension in her jaw eased, and he sensed that in some small way she had accepted. The day passed in quiet rhythm. Calder repaired a fence while keeping an eye on the horizon, unease never fully leaving him. She rested, sometimes dozing, sometimes watching from the window with a gaze that searched everything. He knew enough of pain to recognize someone who had learned never to let their guard drop. But when he returned at dusk, he found her sketching in the ashes of the hearth with one finger, tracing shapes that spoke of memory, circles for the sun, lines for people, stick figures for violence endured. Her silent story cut deeper than words, but when she pointed to herself, and then to the running figure she had drawn, Calder understood. You defended yourself, he said softly, and they punished you for surviving. Her eyes met his, fierce with truth. He nodded, his throat tight. You did nothing wrong. Something in her gaze shifted at those words, as if kindness was a language she had nearly forgotten. That night, the desert air grew heavy, storm clouds gathering in the distance. Calder checked his rifle, laying it near the bedroll. She lay on his bed again, still weak but calmer, her breathing steadier. As thunder rolled across the horizon, she turned her face toward him, lips parting as if to speak. No sound came, but her eyes, dark, luminous, alive, seemed to whisper the words her voice could not yet find. Calder held her gaze until the storm broke, rain drumming softly against the adobe roof. He thought of how healing often came not in grand gestures, but in small moments of presence. Warmth offered in silence, mercy shown without condition. As he lay back, the thought carried him into sleep, that in saving her life, perhaps he had stumbled into a new chance at his own. Outside, the desert drank the rain in silence, each drop a promise of renewal. And inside, two souls, broken by different pasts, lay beneath the same fragile shelter, the first threads of connection weaving between them, threads that would soon be tested by the world waiting at their door. The third day dawned with a sky streaked in rose and silver, the desert softened by the rare calm that comes after rain. The air was gentler, carrying the smell of wet earth, a scent that always reminded Calder that even the harshest land could be cleansed and renewed. He stepped outside to fetch water, his boots sinking into damp soil, and for the first time in weeks he felt something in him ease. When he returned, the sound of movement inside the house made him pause. She was no longer lying flat on his bed. Instead, she had pushed herself upright, her thin frame outlined in the amber light from the window. She was watching him, not with fear now, but with a careful curiosity. Her dark eyes followed his every step, measuring, studying. He set the bucket down gently, offering a faint smile, as if to reassure her that he carried no threat. "You're stronger today," he said, though he knew she would not reply in words. Her silence had become its own language, one he was slowly learning to understand. He prepared a meal of cornbread and beans, the familiar motions steadying him. When he placed the bowl in her lap, her hands shook, not entirely from weakness, but from something deeper, an old habit of expecting what was given to be snatched away. He stepped back, giving her space, and returned to his chair. They ate together without sound, yet he felt the quiet was not empty, but full of something unspoken, fragile and growing. Later, as the sun climbed, he found her near the hearth again, tracing figures in the ash. This time she drew a circle, then a figure lying flat, another looming above with a knife. Calder's chest tightened. She paused, then added more, figures surrounding, watching, and finally one smaller figure fleeing. When she pointed to herself, her meaning became clear. He crouched beside her, his voice low and steady. "He tried to harm you, didn't he? And you defended yourself." She looked at him, eyes blazing with unshed tears, and nodded once, firm. Calder felt a rush of anger, not at her, but at the injustice that had left her broken and branded. "Then they should have listened," he whispered. "They should have seen the truth." He let silence sit between them, offering her the dignity of not forcing more from her than she could give. Yet in that silence something shifted. The stiffness in her shoulders loosened, and though she said nothing, her gaze softened, as if she'd been waiting for someone to believe her without demand, without doubt. That evening the storm clouds gathered again, not of rain, but of unease. A dust cloud appeared on the eastern horizon, moving with the precision of cavalry. Calder's stomach knotted as 6 riders approached, their brass glinting in the last light of day. He stood on the porch, hands in plain sight, though his Winchester leaned within reach. The lieutenant leading them was young, his uniform still carrying the crispness of the East. He introduced himself as Theodore Roosevelt, his voice firm but not unkind. They spoke of a settler named Coltrane, dead only days ago, and of a native girl seen fleeing. Calder kept his face calm, though every word drove nails into the fragile peace he had begun to build. The lieutenant showed him a crude sketch that could have been anyone with dark hair and copper skin. "She's dangerous," Roosevelt said, though even he seemed unconvinced. Calder shook his head. "Just me and my horse out here." The soldiers asked to search, but Calder refused, his voice steady as stone. "Man's home is his castle. You'll need more than a sketch and a story." The lieutenant studied him, suspicion and understanding flickering in his eyes, then finally pulled back. Before leaving, he offered a warning. The locals were restless, full of anger and less inclined toward patience. Calder thanked him, though the words were heavy with irony. He stood watching until the riders disappeared into the desert haze, then turned back to the house. She was waiting just inside the door, her face pale, her hands trembling. He met her gaze. "You heard?" She nodded, and for a moment he thought she might speak, her lips parting, her throat working. But no sound came. Instead, she moved to the hearth again, drawing quickly, desperately. A man with a knife. A struggle. Witnesses standing nearby. She pointed to herself, to the standing figure, then to the knife in the dead man's hand. Calder's jaw clenched. "Self-defense," he said quietly. She nodded again, her whole body shaking as if telling her story without words was almost more painful than silence. When she finally sat back, exhausted, he crouched beside her, his hand hovering near but not quite touching. "Then there's nothing shameful in what you did. You fought for your life. That's nothing to be condemned." Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. Instead, she looked at him with a mix of disbelief and gratitude, as if kindness was a language she had almost forgotten but longed to hear again. That night, while preparing his rifle, Calder spoke into the dimness, his voice low but certain. "If they come, they'll find more than they expect. I won't hand you over." She looked at him, her lips trembling as though fighting words she could not shape. Instead, she crossed the room, placed her hand lightly on his arm, and then pulled back, almost as if burned. It was only a brief touch, but it lingered in him long after, a spark of trust where there had been only silence. The storm broke after midnight, rain slashing against the adobe walls, thunder shaking the beams. Calder sat by the window, rifle across his knees, watching the horizon. She sat by the fire, charcoal in hand, sketching not the past this time, but something different. When he asked softly, she turned the page toward him. A bird, its wings ablaze, rising from flame. "Phoenix," he murmured, remembering stories his mother once told him. She pointed to herself. The crack of distant hooves cut through the storm. Calder's muscles tensed. He doused the lantern with one quick breath. Outside, figures emerged from the rain, men without uniforms, their horses restless in the lightning's glare. A voice shouted through the storm, calling his name, demanding the girl. Calder felt her at his side, tense, trembling, yet unyielding. For the first time since he had cut her down, her voice broke free, rough and cracked but clear. "Fight," she whispered, and then, stronger, another word. "Together." Her voice carried more than sound. It carried life itself, breaking chains heavier than rope. Calder felt his chest swell with something fierce and unshakable. He turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers with steady fire. The storm outside raged, but the storm within him quieted, anchored by the knowledge that he was no longer standing alone. And as lightning split the sky and angry voices pressed closer, the two of them braced side by side, ready to face the fury of a world unwilling to understand. The rain came hard at first, pelting the adobe roof like a scatter of thrown pebbles, then softened to a hush that sounded almost like breath. The men outside were not patient men. Their voices snarled through the storm, ugly with drink and certainty. Calder crouched by the door, rifle in hand, feeling the way the house seemed to tighten around them. Mud walls breathing, beams creaking, a living thing bracing for impact. She stood beside the other window, slight and still, the shadow of her profile steady as flint. "Together," she had said, and the word was a lantern in his chest. He didn't look at her now. He didn't need to. Her presence was a warm current that ran from the crown of his head to his boots, planted firm on the floor. Outside, a horse screamed, spooked by lightning or the boil of human voices, and the sound split the night. A man shouted Calder's name. Another voice promised fire. He lifted a hand toward the window, just 2 fingers barely raised, and she nodded, understanding a command he hadn't spoken. Wait for the right moment. He stepped into the doorway, half-shadowed, rain slashing his shoulders. "You boys picked poor timing," he called, voice calm, almost conversational. "Storm's the wrong partner for a fight." The nearest rider leaned from the saddle, the whites of his eyes bright under the brim of his hat. "Send her out, Wyatt. This ends clean." "Nothing about this is clean," Calder said. Lightning stitched the sky, illuminating faces slick with rain and anger. "You know it, and I know it." He kept talking, slow as card play. Words meant to hold eyes on him, not the back of the house. The seconds were shy, wild things. He gathered them gently, buying time. Behind him, she moved like water, soundless and sure. He felt her absence at his flank, the way a man misses a heartbeat, fiercely and with purpose. The men outside shifted, anxious, their horses skating in mud. When one rider twisted to glance toward the house's far side, Calder made his voice carry, low and steady, shaping it to fill the space. 5 minutes, he said, as if bargaining. "Let me talk to her." The storm rolled its drum. Another flash, a knife edge of silence, then chaos. A tether rope whipped free on the far side of the yard. A startled gelding reared, striking sparks off a stone, and bolted into 2 horses knotted side by side. Saddles knocked, men cursed, hooves churned. Calder dove back, a bullet splintering the doorframe where his shoulder had been. He hit the floor and rolled up to one knee in one practiced motion and fired once, just once, enough to split the night with warning rather than blood. Outside, someone swore at the sky as much as at him. She was already a flicker in the storm, low and fast, hair slicked dark against her back, the kitchen knife flashing only when lightning dared to reveal it. Another rope parted. A third snapped like a dried reed. Horses bucked and surged, the herd mind taking over where human order dissolved. 2 men tried to dismount at once and ended up in the mud, boots skidding, curses lost to the rain. "Fire!" someone yelled. The word was a match head. Calder swung to the side window and saw it. Oil rags bound to a stick, the strike of flint. Even in the downpour it might catch. He lifted the rifle and let his breath go long and quiet. One clean shot. The torch fell, unlit, and the would-be arsonist stumbled backward, clutching a grazed forearm. Another report cracked from the ridge north of the house. Not his. The man with the torch dropped to a knee with a yell. For one suspended second, the world brightened with the fact of it. They were not alone. The sudden two-front pressure broke the men's nerve. "Fall back!" A voice that might have been Joe Prescott's cut ragged through the weather. "Get the horses, damn it! Get the—" The last words drowned in thunder and hoof noise. Men scrambled after scrambling animals, the neat circle around Calder's yard unravelling into loose rope and raw fear. Calder waited, breath held, the rifle's stock a living heat against his palm. He counted the staggered shouts, the slap of reins, the dwindling drum of hooves. When quiet finally widened, he stood and moved to the door. "Lena?" His voice was all bone-deep. "I'm here," she said from the darkness by the chicken coop, not quite a whisper, not quite a cry. The word trembled, but held. She came into the wash of window light, soaked through, hair dripping, eyes bright with the kind of courage that leaves a man wordless. He reached for her and didn't quite touch. She reached for him and did. Her hand found his forearm, a brief press of skin to skin. It felt like a vow. The ridge figure announced himself by the careful sound of boots on wet stone. Calder kept the rifle canted down, friendly, as a man with a beard like greying chaparral and eyes that knew lonely ground stepped into the yard. "Benjamin Franklin Tucker," the stranger said, tipping 2 fingers from the brim of his hat. "Folks call me Frank. Heard bad intentions on the wind." He cocked an eyebrow toward the retreating dark. "Figured you'd be outnumbered." "Appreciate your timing," Calder said. He glanced at the woman beside him. She stood tall despite the water needling her clothes, chin lifted. Frank nodded to her with an ease that surprised Calder. "Ma'am." Inside, with rain sighing against the walls and the fire coaxed back from embers, they drank whiskey, the way men drink for warmth more than forgetting. Frank told them what he'd heard of Coltrane, that the man was mean-sober and worse after sundown, and not all debts owed him were of the decent kind. The girl, she listened with eyes that moved between speakers, catching scents like a hawk catches wind. When the storm gentled to a patter and Frank's rifle leaned easy against the wall, Calder turned to her. "You spoke," he said softly. "Together. And before that, fight." He made the words gentle, not demanding. "Thank you." She wrapped her hands around the warm cup Frank had pressed on her and breathed its heat like medicine. When she looked up, something new stood in her gaze, caution still, but also the fine thread of trust strung taut and humming. She set the cup down carefully and touched her chest. "Ayana," she said, voice rough from disuse, syllables like a string of river stones. He felt the words settle inside him with the gravity of truth. "Ayana," he repeated, quiet as prayer. The name fit the room like it had been here all along, waiting to be spoken. A calm unfurled then, the kind that comes after a danger shared. They dried blankets by the fire, and Frank, respecting a boundary even he couldn't have named, stretched out under the window with his hat over his eyes, leaving them the hush that existed between two people who have seen one another bleed, if not with blood, then with fear. When Calder moved to check the door, Ayana rose too, not to follow, but to stand looking at the phoenix she had sketched earlier. In the orange light, The bird's wings sank and lifted as flame shadows moved, a trick of light and hope. He came to stand at her shoulder, close enough to feel the heat of her, not so close as to corner. "You drew yourself up out of fire," he said. And the rain came. Her mouth curved, not quite a smile, but near enough to soften the hard set of her jaw. "Fire kills," she said slowly, searching for words. "And fire cleanse." Her hand hovered above the sketch. "I burn and rise. You," she touched his sleeve, light as a moth, "pull me to sky." He swallowed, the ache behind his ribs both sharp and sweet. "I only did what a man ought," he murmured, "cut a person down from a wrong tree." Ayana tipped her head, considering him. "Many see, not cut," she said. The English made room for Apache music, vowels carrying warmth even when hoarse. "You cut." Her gaze dropped to his hands, scarred and steady. Good hands. He had never been so aware of them. The scuffs where a rope had burned him in a winter storm, the clean crescent of a healed blade nick from sharpening too fast, the way his knuckles tightened and relaxed now like a creature learning a new name. "They don't always do right," he said. "I've let go when I should have held on. Held on when I should have let go." She looked up at that, and for a heartbeat they stood in a still water where long truths could be set down and not sink. "We learn," she said, simple and sure. "Heart remembers. Body learns." She placed her palm flat against her own sternum, then, slow, asking permission without words, lifted it to his chest. Heat through cloth. His breath stumbled, and then found itself. The moment didn't stretch into something it wasn't. It settled into what it was. Two humans, finding the shape of comfort that didn't cost either of them their dignity. He set his palm lightly over hers, not pressing, only sheltering her hand. The fire hummed. Frank snored soft as a dog. Rain ticked time on the roof. Calder's heart, unruly for years, kept an even pace, as if reminded of its work. She withdrew first and returned to the bed, not as a convalescent, but as someone choosing rest. He turned down the lantern wick and settled on his bedroll, not far, not near, a respectful distance mapped by instinct and care. He had thought sleep would hang back after so much noise, but it came the way sleep sometimes comes to tired children, with the mercy of surprise. They woke to a world scrubbed clean. Morning tilted through the window like a promise, and the smell of wet creosote rose from the yard. Calder boiled coffee. Frank stretched and declared it the kind that could bleach a horse's teeth. Ayana smiled into her tin cup like she was memorizing the taste. The smallness of the moment made it precious. 3 people alive in one room, rain working its quiet alchemy outside. They worked in the morning. Repairs for the damage that thunder and men had done. Ayana insisted on helping. She moved carefully, conserving strength without surrendering it, a way of walking that told the word survivor without any need for letters. Calder watched out of the tail of his eye, stepping in with a steadying hand when a bucket sloshed, backing away before help turned into taking over. Midday slid into the long gold of afternoon, and with it came a question rolling in like a dust devil. What next? The storm had been a skirmish, not the war. Bad men don't always accept a thwarting as a lesson. Sometimes they take it as an invitation to escalate. Frank saddled up to ride a slow circle and read the land for sign. "I'll be back before stars," he said, and left them a pouch of bullets and a promise they weren't alone. When the door closed, a hush like a held breath settled in shoulders and floorboards alike. Calder stood with his hands braced on the table, looking at the map of the day in coffee rings and a scatter of crumbs. He felt Ayana behind him before he saw her. A brush of presence, that warm current again. "I can go," she said, and the simplicity of it shook him. Her English did a brave thing with few words. "I leave. Men, stop." He turned then, fast enough that the chair leg caught his boot and skittered. "No." It came out rough. The kind of rough that is less anger than refusal to let the world narrow to cruelty. He tried again, gentler. "No, Ayana. I won't be the man who lets you believe you are the trouble instead of the truth." He spread his hands. "You are not a problem to be solved. You're a person. You stay because you choose to, and if you go, it's because you choose that too, not because men shout." She studied him like a landscape, angles and shadows, and something in her eased, a delicate uncoiling, as if the rope around her ribs had been clever enough to learn how to tie itself, and now, invisibly, began to loosen. "Choose," she said, tasting the word. "I choose." She set her jaw at a tender angle. "I stay." The afternoon warmed from there, not by the sun, although it did its part, but by small acts repeated. A loaf sliced, a shirt patched, a bucket filled and emptied and filled again, a window propped, a laugh escaping her like a shy bird when the chicken made an unholy racket at a fat lizard skittering the wall. Calder found himself telling stories with the edges sanded down. How Helena could whistle 2 notes at once, how Abraham tried to drink from a bucket already frozen, how the first snow in this country looks like sifted flour over red rock and makes even sorrow look briefly clean. When he spoke his sister's name, the room changed key. Grief is a plain where wind runs long. It makes its own weather. He felt it blow through him, a familiar ache, and kept going, not to make a monument, just to lay flowers where they belonged. Ayana listened the way only someone who has buried too many names can listen, with her whole face, her whole quiet. "Helena," she repeated softly, and gave the name a place to sit. "My mother say," she lifted a hand, searching for a word, "say, spirit stays where love stays. She hear?" She touched the space between his collarbones. "When you are kind, when you are brave, when you laugh." A small smile. "When you make bad coffee." He laughed before he meant to. It felt like a door opening in a room he had convinced himself had no windows. "It is terrible coffee," he admitted, "but it's strong." "Strong," she agreed. "Like you." Then, quiet as breath, "Like me." He watched that land in her, like me, and knew the ground had shifted. The woman who had survived the tree and the desert sun was teaching herself a new grammar. Not only I endure, but I am. He didn't crow over it. He just stood inside the warm fact of it and let it light the corners. Near dusk, Frank rode back with a smear of worry across his brow. He tied off, leaned his hip on the post, and gave them the field report in a voice tuned for calm. Prescott had gathered in town, jaw set like a trap. He'd been talking in a saloon built of splinters and bile, about lines, about purity, about teaching examples. Men with more anger than sense were nodding along. "He'll come back," Frank said. "If not tonight, then soon, with more." The room, which had learned all day how to relax, drew itself up again, a horse listening for the rattle of a snake. Calder felt the old steadiness take hold, the one that had kept him alive through winters and bad herds, and a boy's war grown monstrous. "Then we prepare," he said simply. He looked to Ayana, not to order, but to include. Together. Together looked like many things. It looked like oiling the Winchester and checking the sights by lamplight. It looked like Frank stringing tin cans on wire behind the chicken coop and Ayana tying small bells at the corner of the corral, a soft trip song to wake the house if feet went where feet shouldn't. It looked like filling all the water buckets and laying extra kindling, because fires get strange ideas when men go strange. It looked like quiet words spoken to a steady horse and a hand pressed to adobe, as if to say to the old earth, "Hold." When the work was done and the first star pricked the violet shoulder of evening, Ayana stood at the open door, the sky cupped in her eyes. "We breathe," she said, almost to herself. She inhaled slow, let it out slower. Storm inside makes storm outside louder. Quiet here, she touched her chest again, makes quiet there. She flicked her chin toward the night. Sometimes? He came to stand beside her. The cool slid over his arms, clean as water. In the hush, a coyote offered a note, then two, another answered. Somewhere far off, a cow bellowed once and then thought better of it. The horizon held its own counsel. He did not plan the next thing. It rose the way heat rises from plain to cloud, inevitable as weather. "Ayana," he said, tasting each letter like a man who has misplaced his sense of sacred and just recovered it. She turned to him with a look that made him stand straighter, not with pride, but with reverence. "You're safe here," he said. "Not because walls promise that, they don't, but because I do." He searched her face for any sign he was stepping where he shouldn't. "I won't leave you to face what you shouldn't have had to face alone." Her eyes shone without spilling over. "I know alone," she said, and the words were plain and heavy and past tense all at once. She lifted her hand, and unlike earlier, it did not hover or ask. It came to his cheek, warm as bread. "I know together now." A breath. "It is healing." The word came shy and right. He covered her hand with his, lids lowering on a wave that neither scalded nor froze. He did not close the distance recklessly. There was no take in him, only an offer. She stepped that last step, the smallest of distances measured in whole constellations, and laid her forehead against his. For a while they breathed that way, two pulses settling into the same time. A first kiss was there if they wanted it, the night saying yes in 8 different languages. But what came was softer, truer, the kind of still closeness that turns a body into a harbor. He didn't know how long they stood. Time inched. Stars multiplied. Somewhere in the yard, a bell chimed, and then hushed. Just the wind, just a note leaning against another, and then strolling on. Frank's boots sounded discreetly inside. A man can be rough-hewn and still know how to make himself small when holiness decides to drop by. He cleared his throat, only when the moment had laid itself down of its own accord. "You ought to see this," he said from the window. "Riders on the rise." Calder and Ayana turned as one. The north ridge was a cut-paper silhouette. Along it moved figures not like the night before, no drunk, no hungry clatter, but a line held in discipline. Cavalry. The lead rider's profile was a drawing of a jaw set on principles. The name came back to Calder, Lieutenant Roosevelt, and with it the memory of a warning spoken in a voice still unsure how to carry authority in this new country. "They're not sneaking," Frank said. "That's a good sign." "Or they don't think they need to," Calder replied, but his shoulders held less worry than his words admitted. The horses halted at the gate. Roosevelt dismounted, lifted a hand, and waited until someone, Calder realized with a jolt that the someone was him, met his gaze and nodded. Only then did he come forward, hat in hand, posture straight as a church bench. The lamplight gave the young officer a look of a boy wearing a man's coat and trying hard not to fidget. "Evening," Roosevelt said. "We need to talk." His glance slid, respectful, to Ayana. "To both of you." Ayana's chin lifted, nerves braided to courage. Calder felt the urge to stand between her and the world. He also felt the newer knowing that partnership is not shielding so much as shouldering. He stood beside her instead, their elbows near enough to almost brush. Roosevelt spoke carefully, like a man picking his way across river stones. "I rode back to Fort S this morning and found a report waiting. 2 Mexican traders came in with a story that complicates the one you've been accused in. They saw Coltrane attack a native girl at sunrise 3 days past. She defended herself with his own knife." He rolled the words in his mouth like truth he wanted to seat properly. "That matches other sign we found." It's sufficient to support a finding of self-defense." The room shifted. Not the walls, something more subtle. The angle at which fear had been waiting in the air relaxed a fraction, like a tight knot trying easy for the first time. Roosevelt rubbed a hand over his face as if surprised to find it was still young. "The locals aren't going to like it. Prescott least of all. He's gathering men on talk that smells like tinder. I can't station a guard here, but I mean to do the next best thing, carry word to town that the army considers this matter settled unless a civil court proves otherwise, and I don't think a fair-minded court will." He paused. "If you're wise, you'll lay low." "We've been laying low," Frank said dryly. "Doesn't stop people from stepping high." Roosevelt's mouth twitched. "No, it doesn't." He looked to Ayana again. "Ma'am," he said, and the word did not sound like a loaded gun for once. It sounded like respect. "You deserve to be left in peace." Ayana listened without blinking. When she answered, she did it in the kind of English that grows overnight like a seed, deciding the soil is for it after all. "Peace is wind," she said. "You feel, you not hold." She touched her chest. "But here," she pressed lightly, "quiet." Her gaze slid to Calder and back to the lieutenant. "We keep quiet here." Roosevelt looked moved and uncomfortable at once, as if his uniform had grown a size too small. "I'll do what I can," he said, and meant it. He tipped his hat and stepped back, pausing at the door as if someone had tugged his sleeve. "Mr. Wyatt," he added, "your stand tonight, the one you and your household made. There's a world some of us are trying to move toward. You're pointed in the right direction." They watched the cavalry depart, dust shining under the moon like the faintest path. Frank lifted the curtain and let it fall. "Half of what he says will help," he said. "The other half will pour kerosene on talk. Men like Prescott don't admire backing down." Calder nodded. The relief that had lapped his ankles pulled back a foot. "Then we plan," he said. He turned to Ayana, and the planning changed shape immediately, not because she was a woman, but because she was Ayana, one who had learned the land with her feet and her mother's stories, one who spoke to air and got answers. "Coyote Wash," she said, naming a ribboned cut in the earth that lay east, where men coming fast would have to slow, where horses knew to place feet careful. She moved a bowl and a tin cup on the table to mark the choke points, set a spoon to show a narrow bend where rock walls came close enough to hear your echo speak back to you. "Here," she said. "We make rock fall, not kill. Scare, stop. Make big loud. Men think, too many. Go home." Frank's grin came in crooked, admiring. "You're a strategist, ma'am." She shrugged, not dismissing the praise so much as placing it aside. "We live," she said. "We learn where wind help us." Calder felt a warmth that wasn't the fire, and wasn't the coffee, and wasn't the whiskey. It was a steadied kind of awe. He saw, all at once, the slow curve of his life pivoting. The point of balance was not a gun, nor a piece of land, not even the stubborn will that had kept him breathing when breathing seemed an idea rather than a fact. The fulcrum was this: a woman who had hung on a tree and refused to die, now standing in his doorway, planning not vengeance but wisdom. He stepped closer, not into her light, only toward it, and laid the back of his fingers against her forearm. "We do it your way," he said. "Scare, stop, make big loud." His mouth tipped at the edge. "Go home." Her eyes smiled even before her lips did. She leaned in just a fraction, not a kiss this time either, but a brush of temple against his cheek, the sort of intimate that happens when two people already inhabit the same weather. The touch lasted the length of a single heartbeat, and somehow filled a century. They worked late, tired in the pleasant, honest way that belongs to people preparing to live. When the last diagram had been sketched, and the last bell tied, and the last plank tested with a boot heel, they let the night take them. Frank to his bed of window and hat, Calder to his roll by the stove, Ayana to his bed, which somehow was no longer his in the exacting sense, but the bed, the place a body recovering took rest. He banked the fire, watched it glow like the heartbeat of the house, and lay down with his hands folded beneath his head. An hour, or 5 minutes, or the time it takes for crickets to decide a new song, he heard her rise. Not the slow, careful steps of someone creeping, the plain steps of someone who wanted to be heard. She came to the edge of his bedroll and folded herself to the floor beside him, back against the stove, bricks still warm. He rolled to face her and propped himself on an elbow. The lamplight was out. The room was a geometry of greys and soft edges. "Calder," she said, and it was the first time she had said his name. It came out like a promise wrapped in healing. He closed his eyes for a split second on the way his chest answered. He opened them again. "I am not ghost now," she said. "Not shadow. Alive." Her hand hovered, then settled on his shoulder. Light, like morning. "Because you cut. Because you stay." He didn't say always because always is a word that spooks if you grab it. He said, "I'm here," which was a fence post sunk deep and true. She seemed to weigh something private and then let it go. "Tomorrow," she said, the syllables soft as quilt batting. "We make big loud," he smiled. "Tomorrow," he agreed. The stove clicked as the last heat loosened from iron. Outside, the night drew itself around the house like a blanket pulled up under a chin. There were men beyond that softness who meant hard things. There were plans on the table and birds on paper, and a ridgeline that would remember cavalry tracks for a week. In the nest of all that, two people sat shoulder to shoulder, and their quiet felt like a tide the moon couldn't refuse. When dawn came, it would find them ready, stronger than fear, clearer than anger, softer than vengeance, and therefore harder to break. It would find them with a plan that turned the land's own wisdom into protection. It would find them moving as one, his stride matching hers, her breath matching his, down toward Coyote Wash, where stone held secrets of time and echo, and how to send men home in the direction they should have taken from the start. And as the last stars blinked their slow farewells, and the first bird tried out a cautious note, the house breathed with them. The desert listened, and the road toward what comes next unrolled, quiet at first, then bold. Dawn found them already moving, quiet as deer along the ridge above Coyote Wash. The world wore its first colors, lavender smudged with pearl, and the air held that fragile balance between night cool and day warm, as if the desert itself was taking a long, steady breath. Calder led the way along the narrow path where Shale whispered under boots, his stride tuned to Ayana's, a rhythm they'd learned without counting. Frank came behind with a coil of wire and a canvas bag that clinked with tin and tools, his hat pulled low to keep the early glare out of his eyes. They reached the bend where the wash cinched tight, rock walls drawing close enough for Echo to speak in careful syllables. Ayana stopped and touched the stone with her palm, as if greeting an old friend. "Here," she said, voice barely above the hush of morning. "Wind speaks, sound stays, men hear big." She tilted her head to listen. Even silence gave back a small, round note. She pointed to the ledge above the bend. "Rock there, ready to fall. Not crush. Stop. Loud." The plan lived in her hands as much as her words. Gestures that mapped force and patience, the elegant geometry of turning a place into protection. Frank scrambled up with a rope, testing the lip, then anchored himself with a grunt. "She's right," he called down. "A nudge on this seam, and we'll send a sermon down the aisle, loud enough to convert half a congregation." He worked a chisel into a crack and set a small powder cap, his hands precise, his attention a steady flame. Calder climbed beside him to help brace, passing stones, wedging wooden shims where the rock had already learned to loosen. Ayana stayed below, reading the ground for where hooves would bunch and balk, measuring distances with her eye. The wash accepted them the way a body accepts a heartbeat, without fuss, as if it had been waiting to be asked to help. When the charges were set and the ropes run, they walked the exit routes, steep scrambles a man could take if he kept his nerve and left his anger behind. "We leave ways out," Ayana said, showing them a finger-width path that slipped along the wall. "Make men choose to go. Choice is medicine." Her smile was small and fierce. "Not all drink, but some." They were back at the ranch by noon, sun now clean and high, the adobe walls warm as a loaf, just pulled from a hearth. They ate standing up, cornbread and cold beans, then set to the other tasks that stitch courage tight. Calder and Frank double-checked the tin alarms and tied off the last bells. Ayana braided strips of cloth, looping them into a length of line for the horses later, her fingers swift, even when her gaze drifted toward the east. He saw that look and understood it. The horizon can be a knife edge when trouble rides somewhere beyond it. He wiped his hands and came to stand with her on the porch. "We've done what can be done," he said gently. "The rest is timing and patience." "Patience," she echoed, rolling the word slow, making friends with it. She turned her face to him and gave a small nod that felt like two hands pressing the same prayer into the same page. And together. It would have been easy to hurry the afternoon, to fill every minute with movement, as if busyness could bridle fear. Instead, they let quiet be another tool. Calder mended a halter with neat stitches, each pass of the needle smoothing the crackle in his nerves. Ayana swept dust into a pan and fed the chickens, and patched a tear in the quilt with thread the color of dry grass. Healing moves like that when it is allowed, small, steady, barely visible, and then all at once the air feels kinder. Frank returned from watering the horses at the far tank with a nod toward the road. "Sign," he said. "Not yet, but soon. The kind of quiet that means noise coming." They slept, if you could call it sleep, in turns, shallow and ready. Evening came, soft-backed, carrying a sweetness of creosote and the faint metal tang of coming tension. Calder tied a bandana around his throat and pulled on the coat he wore when weather had a mind of its own, then checked the Winchester by lamplight. Ayana braided her hair tight and slid a small knife into the boot top, then lifted her bow to test the string. He glanced over with gentled surprise. "You shoot?" he asked, not doubting, only hungry for the new way he could know her. She lifted the bow, drew it once, silent strength and perfect line, then let it down. "My mother," she said. Nothing else was needed. They left the lamp low and stepped out into the blue hour when outlines grow precise. The desert gathered its night sounds, crickets measuring, an owl shouldering through shadow, while stars pricked awake one by one. They walked to the ridge path with the light step of those who have learned to let the land carry half their weight. Frank went ahead to the ledge. Ayana and Calder took positions where they could see the mouth of the wash and signal with a hand or a breath. The rope felt like a living thing in Calder's palm, quiet as a vein, waiting for the pulse they would call through it. Long minutes passed. Patience settled on his shoulders like a shawl, and under it his mind eased from the future's tangle back into this exact night. The smell of stone cooling, the far sigh of wind, the steady nearness of Ayana just at his left, her breath even, eyes alert. He did not look at her, because looking might drag him out of the delicate present. He simply knew her there, a constant warmth he could lean on without leaning. Hoofbeats, faint at first, found the air, not the sloppy clatter of men who trusted luck. An organized line, horses held in hand, someone at the front believing himself a kind of shepherd. The sound drew closer and found the washer's lips, narrowed by time and water, forced to single file. A murmured curse floated up. A second voice hushed it. The led rider entered the pinch. Calder's palm lifted, 2 fingers showing. Frank's silhouette shifted on the ledge. The line of riders poured into the throat of stone. 10, 15, 20, more. The wash swallowing them, echo turning them into a single long animal with many legs. When the tail of the thing slithered into the bend and the head began to hesitate, Calder closed his hand. Frank's weighted pry did the rest. The first rock went like a cough, the second like a shout. Then the seam surrendered its small decision with a roar. Stone bloomed downward, not like a hammer, but like a door swinging shut. Dust rose and multiplied the effect, a living fog. Horses went light on their feet, sidestepping, snorting. Men dropped to knees, coughing, grabbing reins. A slick of fear ran the length of the line. Ayana's hand touched Calder's sleeve once. He tugged the second line, and a sister fall sealed the rear of the column with a clatter that sounded larger than it was. In the muffled half-dark, one man's panic flared into many. "Ambush!" someone screamed. "Too many!" another coughed. That was the part of the plan Ayana had counted on more than stone. The mind's talent for making shadows grow teeth. "Hold your fire," Calder said under breath to no one in particular and to the world in general. They were here to turn men back, not to water the soil with rage. Ayana moved to the edge where her voice could slide clean and true down the canyon walls. She cupped her hands, making a listening bowl, then let 2 words fall like pebbles into a pond. "Turn back." Echo caught them and returned them larger. "Turn back, back, back." She waited, then sent another. "No blood." Echo made that a bell. "No blood, no blood." Frank rattled a line of cans, a tin rain of ghost soldiers, a regiment that existed only in the kind of fear men invite when they arrive convinced of their own story. The canyon answered with its own theatre, the scrape of hooves never quite where a man expected, the toss of a bit sounding like iron teeth. Someone fired wild. The bullet slapped harmless at Calder's rock, and the ricochet sounded like an army cracking knuckles. Calder raised the Winchester only when a rider near the middle pinned his horse and swung a torch from under a slicker, brave or foolish enough to try to make day of night in a place designed for shadow. One crack from Calder's rifle, a clean bite at the torch-handled stick. The flame dropped, hissed, and died in the dust. Silence fell so sudden even the horses listened. "Turn back," Ayana called again, the words warm this time, not scolding. "There are ways out. Take them. Go home." She mapped with sound what she and Calder had mapped with care, the finger-width path along the wall, the trick of angling a horse sideways up a slope that looked too steep until it wasn't. "Go," she said, and that small word felt like water. There's a moment when a group decides. No single man in charge of it, no vote taken, just a kind of shared exhale that releases one desire and chooses another. Calder felt that moment travel the length of the canyon like a shiver. The led horse turned under a soft hand. The man behind mirrored it. A third followed because following is a relief when pride has had its say. The rear shifted, tested the fallen rock, found the gap Ayana had left under the shelving lip, just wide enough if a rider leaned and trusted his mount. Someone, he would have bet on Prescott by the way the word bit, cursed loud about cowards, about finishing what they started, about the dirt needing a message written in fire. The wash didn't carry that voice well. The stone gave it back thin, the teeth taken out. Other voices rose instead, tired, raw, undercut with something like shame. The long animal of men and horses slowly found its feet backward. One by one, like beads reversed on a string, they slipped out, shook dust, and faced the way they'd come. When the last tail vanished and the wash breathed its own quiet again, Calder's shoulders dropped an inch he hadn't realized they were holding. He turned to Ayanna. Her eyes were bright and steady. Frank whooped under his breath, a sound a boy might make when the river finally gives up its fish. "Elegant," he said, and thumped the rock with affection. They stayed on watch long enough to be certain the decision would hold, then moved like cat feet back along the ridge. No one spoke until the house came into view, small and square and golden with the lamp they'd left low. The sight hit Calder with the force of an old truth. Shelter is not walls, it is people. The two souls beside him made every angle of the place make sense. Inside, with the door bolted and the rifle set by the jamb, Frank poured whiskey into tin cups and raised his with a grin. "To making big loud," he said, "and to second thoughts." Ayanna lifted her cup, and then, in a gesture as old as any ceremony, tipped the first sip to the floor, honor for the land that had lent them its cleverness. "To home," she said. The word filled the room, then gently overflowed. They ate what could be called supper, bread torn by hand, cheese cut thin, a slice of an apple Frank had saved, sweeter than it had any right to be. The three of them warmed themselves at the fire and let the story of what they'd done lay between them without prodding it, the way you let a newly set bone be, trusting the marrow to do good work. Later, Frank rolled into his corner and tipped his hat over his eyes. "Wake me if the bells talk," he muttered, and was gone, just like that. The house gentled. Calder checked the latch a last time and turned to find Ayanna by the shelf where the phoenix drawing leaned against a jar of buttons. The charcoal lines looked darker tonight, feathers more sure. "It is different," she said, fingertip hovering over the curve of the wing. Before, bird alone in fire. Now, two wings, one mine, one yours. She turned, light pooling in her eyes. "Together flies true." He came closer until he could see the faint smudge of charcoal on her knuckle. He took her hand and, without thinking, lifted that finger to wipe the mark away with his thumb. The touch was nothing and everything. "I have never been a wing," he said, a tired smile bending his mouth. "Mostly a stubborn foot." She laughed, soft and low, the sound of river over small stones. "Foot good," she said, patting his chest. "Stands, holds. Wing needs foot to jump. Foot needs wing to rise." She tilted her head, considering him with the kind of attention he had only ever known in the middle of a field where evening had turned every blade of grass to silver. "We are both." Time, which had been all rush and edge, softened so they could walk through it. They stood near the hearth, where light makes a kind of mercy on faces, and if there was a weight in the room, it was the sweet kind, the gravity that holds one star to another. He wanted to kiss her, felt the wanting like the tide's tug in his bones, but desire was not the first language of this moment. Trust was. He lifted a curl freed from her braid and put it behind her ear, watching his fingers learn the map of her with reverence. Her hand rose to his neck, finding the place just under his hairline where warmth pools. She pressed her palm there lightly, as if blessing, and he closed his eyes at the power of the simple touch. "Alive," she whispered, a word like a lamp in winter. "We are alive." They sat on the floor with their backs against the warm bricks of the stove, shoulders touching, breaths learning each other again. The fire spoke in quiet clicks. Calder told her about the tree where he'd found her, not to reopen the wound, but to tell the truth of what had changed since. How the sign lay in the yard waiting to be burned, how his hands had shook, cutting her down, and how they didn't shake now. Ayana listened, thumb tracing the seam of his shirt-sleeve, her face composed in that deep attention that heals by seeing. When he fell silent, she shifted so she could see him fully. "Sometimes spirit goes away from body," she said, tapping her chest. "Hides in mountain or wind because body too much pain. Tonight, my spirit came back. The whole of me." She set her palm over her heart and then over his. "I feel it. Here. And here." He bowed his head, not with shame, not with sorrow, just with the relief of a man who knows he has walked in the right direction long enough to find water. "Thank you for coming back," he said, the words steady. She smiled, and the room brightened as if the lamp had opened its eye another notch. "Thank you for waiting." They drifted into a sleep that did not clutch at the throat. If dreams came, they came with gentler edges, her grandmother's voice counting stars, Helena's laugh rolling down a Missouri dirt road, a hawk drawing circles above a canyon that had chosen quiet. Morning's first gold found them ready again, because living asks that kindness of us over and over. Frank was at the door before the coffee had finished its first boil, his hat brim shining with dew. "2 pieces of news," he said. "Bad first. Prescott's not done. The men who turned back last night are already telling he was leading them wrong. Pride's a horse that'll buck him straight into something stupid. The good. Word from town says the lieutenant made a speech out in front of the Mercantile, official-like, about what those traders saw. A few folks listened. A few more pretended not to, and listened anyway." Ayana poured coffee and slid a cup into Frank's broad hand. "Words fall like rain," she said. "Some ground drink slow." "Some ground spits it right back," Frank said with a snort. "But I'll take a slow drink over a drought." They spent the day mending what needed mending, strengthening what had been made the day before. Ayana showed Calder how to read a bird's sudden silence and a rabbit's change of path. Calder, in return, showed her the fence line's logic and how to read a cloud's belly for what kind of wind rode inside it. These were not lessons so much as ways of naming the same thing. The world is always talking. We can learn to hear. Near evening, a rider appeared alone on the horizon, unhurried, straight-backed. Abraham snorted hello before Calder could. He recognized the horse before the man, a bay with a scar on its flank that looked like a comma. Roosevelt swung down and tied off with care, the gesture of someone who has learned not to spook what he wishes to befriend. "Brought you a map," he said without preamble once they were inside, laying it on the table with the pride of a boy who has actually brought something useful to a man he admires. "Back routes and dry gulches most folks forget." He tapped a line with a blunt fingertip. "If you ever need to leave quick, this will buy you hours." Calder met his gaze. "We aim to stay." "I figured," Roosevelt said, and the look in his eye held a complicated alloy of respect and concern. But sometimes staying means knowing how to move first, so you can come back on your own terms. He glanced at Ayana. I hope you never need it. The sincerity of that hope was as plain as an unbuttoned collar. Ayana set a plate of bread by his elbow, and when he thanked her, said, Your words last long today. She inclined her head toward the east. Men turned. Some, Roosevelt said, choosing honesty over comfort. Enough to make tomorrow different than yesterday. He folded his hat in his hands. I'll keep pushing the line where I can. Then, as if something in him couldn't help it, he smiled, the boy rising again to the surface. Your wash trick. Heard it clean to town like a rumor. You made a canyon sound like an entire regiment. Half the men in the saloon claimed they saw 50 guns. He shook his head, impressed. You saved more than yourselves last night. You saved some of those men from their own worst choices. After he left, the house felt larger for a while, as if the walls had shifted to fit the day's hope. Calder and Ayana stood at the doorway, the map still on the table behind them, the sky ahead painted with sunset's old hymn. The mountains cupped the light in their long hands. A small wind carried the smell of sage and the faintest memory of rain. Sometimes we move, Ayana said, looking at the line Roosevelt had traced. Sometimes we stay, both strong. Both, he agreed, and reached for her hand. She gave it. The fit was the easy fit of something honest, like a tool that has finally learned the shape of the work it was meant to do. He felt the next part rise in him, not as a speech, not as a performance, just as speech becomes in a house where truth has become the custom. Ayana, he said, and the old ache in his chest made way kindly for the new. Whatever comes, I will meet it with you. This door stays open to you. This roof holds for you. This name. He swallowed, feeling the precise strangeness of the words. This name is yours to carry beside your own if you want it. Not because the world needs permission to see you as mine, because I do. Because I am yours, and I want to be counted that way. She did not answer too quickly. She stepped close so that he could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the brave steadiness of the mouth that had learned again how to shape sound. She touched his heart with the flat of her hand. You say true, she whispered, not for paper, for breath. Her other hand came up to his cheek, and this time the kiss that found them was not hesitation, but a beginning. Warm, unhurried, with the taste of bread and coffee and 1,000 miles of desert that had taught them both the cost and gift of tenderness. They parted with their foreheads leaned together, smiling in the way people smile when a home has been named out loud. Beyond them, the desert held its breath and then released it. Somewhere, a coyote laughed like an old friend. Frank whooped once from the corral and pretended not to be listening as he hammered a hinge into place. Night gathered, generous and wide, and the house lit itself from within, a small lantern set against a country that loved to test. They would sleep and wake and work and defend and welcome and mend. Tomorrow would bring the next weather, the next word, the next decision, but the shape of it would be the same. Two people standing side by side under a sky big enough to hold what they dared to build. And while the eastern dark considered its own quiet, a distant flicker at the edge of the valley hinted at movement again. Not the chaotic scatter of frightened men this time, but the slow coiling of something proud and wounded preparing to strike. Prescott was not done. The land felt it. The wind carried it. The bells on the corral line lay still for now, but they would speak when the hour turned. Calder squeezed Ayana's hand, a promise without embroidery. She squeezed back, and their shared pulse found a steady beat, a rhythm you could walk a lifetime by, even into whatever storm might be stirring beyond the ridge. The days that followed carried a strange hush, as if the desert itself was waiting, crouched between breaths. Morning light spilled across the adobe walls, painting them gold, and Ayana moved through the rooms with more strength than before, each step steadier, each gesture more certain. She still carried the quiet of someone used to listening before speaking, but her silence had changed. It no longer spoke of fear, but of choice, a calm watchfulness that steadied the very air. Calder felt it whenever she passed near him, the way a flame feels the nearness of another flame, a heat doubled, a presence undeniable. They worked together with Frank to fortify the ranch, not with frantic fear, but with the deliberate rhythm of those who have accepted what may come. Fences were mended, water barrels filled, spare ammunition stored in corners only Calder knew. Ayana walked the perimeter each dawn, eyes sharp as a hawk's, noting where the ground sloped and where shadows lingered longest. Calder often found himself watching her move against the horizon, the braid down her back swaying like a river of night, and something in him eased whenever he did. By evening they would gather by the fire, and it was in those hours that healing worked its quietest magic. Ayana began to speak more, not in long threads, but in careful beads of words. She told stories of her grandmother, who had said the land had a pulse like a heart, that if you pressed your ear to the earth, you could hear it steady as breath. She spoke of childhood games by the river, of songs carried on wind, of a life once unbroken before loss had scattered it like dry leaves. Calder listened with the reverence of a man drinking at the only spring for miles. Every word she offered a drop of water he knew to treasure. One night, as stars burned fierce above, she asked him of Missouri, of the sister he had named her for. His voice broke as he told of Helena, bright as firelight, stolen by war and cruelty. Ayana reached across the space between them and touched his arm lightly. "She still walks," she said, pressing her palm to his chest. "Here, when you laugh, when you choose mercy, when you stand." He had no answer but to cover her hand with his, and in that touch something fractured inside him finally knit closed. As days passed, their bond wove itself deeper, not only in shared work or spoken truth, but in the smaller moments. Ayana humming softly as she stirred beans over the fire, Calder brushing dust from her shoulder after a long walk, the way her smile, rare but real, lit the dim house brighter than any lantern. Healing hid itself in these small exchanges, building something stronger than walls or rifles, but the world beyond their adobe was restless. Rumors drifted in on Frank's return rides from town. Prescott's pride had been wounded, and wounded pride is the most dangerous kind. He was gathering men again, 30 or more, swelling his anger with talk of purity and vengeance. Calder listened, jaw tight, while Ayana sat silent, her eyes steady but burning with a quiet fire. "He will come," Frank said, "and he will come soon." That night, Calder lay awake on his bedroll, listening to Ayana's even breathing from the bed above. He turned her name over in his mind like a stone worn smooth by river water. Ayana, eternal blossom. He thought of how she had once hung between life and death, and how now she stood strong beside him. He realized then that his own heart had been hanging too, strangled by solitude, until she had brought it back to life with her presence. He closed his eyes and let that truth settle. He loved her. It was not a flare of sudden fire, but the slow, deep burn of coals that promised warmth through a long winter. The storm came on a moonless night, riders appearing out of darkness like ghosts called up from the earth. The bells strung across the corral sang first, a thin silver chime, then the dogs barked low and urgent. Calder was already at the window, rifle in hand, when Ayana appeared at his side, her braid swinging loose, knife in her belt, bow strung tight. "Together," she said again, her voice low but strong. He nodded once, the word enough to anchor him. The attackers fanned out across the yard, their shouts mixing with thunder as the storm finally broke. Rain slashed down, lightning casting everything in quick, brutal flashes. Calder fired from the window, careful, steady, driving men back from the porch. Ayana slipped like a shadow from one window to the other, loosing arrows sharp and true, each shot an answer to the cruelty that had once tried to silence her. Frank shouted from the far side, his rifle a steady drumbeat in the storm. Prescott's voice cut through the chaos, promising fire, demanding blood. But the storm had its own ideas. Horses bucked, terrified by the noise, scattering men into confusion. Ayana moved with fierce grace, cutting lines, spooking mounts, turning the enemy's strength into weakness. Calder covered her with his rifle, his heart hammering not only with fear for her safety, but with awe at her courage. At one point, lightning split the sky, and for an instant Calder saw her fully, rain streaming down her face, eyes bright, bow drawn and steady. She looked like something more than flesh, like the phoenix she had drawn in charcoal, alive with fire, even in the heart of the storm. He felt love surge through him so strong it steadied his hands even as bullets tore splinters from the walls. The fight stretched long into the night, but by dawn the attackers had broken, fleeing into the rain-soaked desert. The yard was scarred, the adobe pitted with bullet holes, but the house still stood. More importantly, so did they. Ayana lowered her bow, breath ragged, hair plastered to her face, but her eyes shone with fierce triumph. Calder crossed the room to her without thinking and caught her in his arms. She let herself lean into him, both of them trembling, not from fear, but from the enormity of what they had survived together. For a long moment they stood in that embrace, the storm easing outside, the house still humming with the memory of violence. Calder pressed his forehead to hers, their breaths mingling. "You saved us," he whispered. "We saved us," she corrected softly. Her hands rested against his chest, feeling the steadiness of his heart. Together! The word wrapped around them like a blanket, and Calder knew then that no force on earth could sever the bond they had forged. The desert had tried, men had tried, but they had endured. Their love was no fragile thing, it was a living force, born of mercy and fire, capable of healing not only themselves, but perhaps even the land around them. As dawn spilled gold across the wet ground, Calder lifted her hand and pressed it to his lips. She did not pull away. Instead, she smiled, small, weary, but real. The storm had passed, but the journey ahead stretched long and uncertain. Still, in that moment, standing side by side in a scarred but unbroken home, they knew they had found something stronger than hate, and as the desert wind carried the smell of rain into the new day, they turned toward the horizon together, ready for whatever battles lay ahead, hearts steady in the knowledge that love, healing, fierce, unyielding, was theirs to carry forward. The week that followed felt like the fragile quiet after a fever breaks. Life, slow, tender, every sound sharpened by the knowledge of how close silence had come to being permanent. The ranch bore scars, bullet holes in the adobe walls, scorched patches in the yard where torches had sputtered out, broken fence posts lying scattered like bones. Yet within those wounded boundaries, something softer had begun to take root. Calder moved with the steadiness of a man who had faced death and chosen life, and Ayana with the grace of one who had been pulled from the edge and now walked toward light with deliberate steps. They repaired what was broken, side by side. Calder patched the walls with new clay, Ayana smoothing the surface with careful hands, her touch making even rough places gentler. She planted herbs in a small bed near the well, whispering in her tongue as she pressed each seed into damp soil, words that sounded like blessings and promises all at once. Calder built new hinges for the barn, his hands strong, but his gaze often drifting to where she knelt in the sun, her braid glistening like polished obsidian. Each time she looked up and caught his eyes, something unspoken passed between them, warmth, gratitude, an ache that was no longer pain, but the echo of it transformed into tenderness. Evenings became the true heart of their days. After the work was done, they sat together by the fire, Frank sometimes with them, sometimes giving them the gift of space. The world outside pressed hard, but inside those walls, time stretched soft. Calder told stories of his childhood, of fishing with his father on summer mornings when the river sang against the stones, of Helena chasing fireflies barefoot in the Missouri dusk. Ayana listened with her whole being, nodding, smiling, her eyes bright with a kind of healing that came not only from surviving, but from being allowed to belong in someone's remembering. In return, she spoke of her grandmother's wisdom, of songs sung in the circle of women at night, voices rising together like smoke from a sacred fire. Her English faltered sometimes, but Calder heard the poetry in her pauses, the music that no broken language could strip away. "My grandmother say," she whispered once, leaning closer so her breath warmed his cheek, "love is not cage, not chain. Love is wind. If strong, it lifts. If weak, it dies. We must be strong wind, Calder." He turned his head slightly so their foreheads touched, and for a long while they stayed that way, the firelight painting their joined shadows onto the wall like a promise. Frank often reminded them that danger was not finished. "Prescott's gathering like a storm cloud," he said, setting down his whiskey one night. "This valley's got memory, and grudges don't fade easy." Calder nodded. But when he glanced at Ayana, he saw no fear in her gaze, only a steady readiness. She had already faced worse than hatred. She had faced death and chosen to rise. The night they truly crossed the threshold into something new came softly, without fanfare. The moon was high, silvering the desert, the air cool after the day's heat. Calder sat sharpening his knife, the rasp of stone soothing, while Ayana braided her hair near the fire. She finished, tied it neatly, then set the braid over her shoulder, and looked at him with an openness that caught him unprepared. Slowly she rose, walked to him, and without a word took the knife from his hands and set it aside. Her palms rested against his chest, feeling his heartbeat. "Why you cut me down?" she asked quietly, the question not of suspicion, but of need, as though she was asking him to name aloud what she already knew. He swallowed, his voice rough. Because leaving you there would have meant leaving myself behind. Because I couldn't be the man who turned away. And because—" He faltered, but her eyes urged him on, steady as stars. "Because I think I loved you even then, before I knew your name." Her breath caught, not in shock, but in recognition. She lifted her hand to his cheek, fingers tracing the scar along his jaw. "I thought my heart dead," she whispered. "But you cut rope from my soul, too. You give it back." Her lips curved into the smallest smile, a fragile flower blooming in the ashes of grief. "Now, my heart says, I love you." The words settled into the space between them with a weight that was not heavy but grounding, like rain seeping into thirsty soil. Calder closed his eyes, overcome, and when he opened them again, he leaned forward, not hurried, not desperate, but with the steady surety of a man offering everything. Their lips met, gentle at first, as if testing the strength of new wings, then deeper, carrying the heat of everything unsaid. It was not just a kiss. It was the binding of two lives, a declaration without need of witness. When they finally parted, Ayana rested her forehead against his, tears glimmering but unshed. "I am not Shadow any more," she said softly. "With you, I am alive. With you, I am Ayana." "Always," he murmured, pressing his hand over hers. "You'll never be alone again." That night, they lay side by side, not out of fear, but choice. Sleep did not come quickly. Instead, they spoke in whispers, sharing pieces of themselves like offerings. She told him her true name meant eternal blossom, and he whispered that she had become the bloom in his barren desert. He spoke of Helena again, and Ayana kissed his brow, saying, "She smiles now, because you love still." They drifted into rest with their hands clasped, the fire crackling low, the storm of the world held at bay beyond adobe walls. Morning came bright and clean, the desert washed by wind, carrying the scent of sage. Calder woke to find Ayana watching him, her dark eyes soft as dawn itself. She touched his face lightly, her voice warm. "Today we live," she said. "Tomorrow maybe fight, but today only live." He smiled and kissed her palm, whispering, "Then today is enough." Outside, the land waited, knowing storms still brewed. But within their small sanctuary, love had taken root, fierce and healing, a bond no hatred could sever. And as they stepped into the sunlight together, the horizon stretched wide before them, a path of struggle and beauty alike, ready to test and strengthen what they had found. The desert wind carried the promise of trials yet to come, but also the whisper of renewal, and hand in hand they walked toward it, hearts bound not by fear, but by the healing certainty of love that had risen from fire and would endure whatever shadows dared to follow. The desert knew how to test even those who had already proven themselves. Word of their stand spread far beyond the valley, whispered in saloons, carried in angry sermons, murmured in hushed tones by those who secretly admired what had been done. Some voices sharpened like knives, others softened like prayer. Prescott gathered again, but this time with numbers swollen to near 60, his fury dressed as righteousness. Men who had once ridden with Calder now stood on the other side, pride and prejudice stronger than memory. Yet in the quiet corners new allies stirred. Frank returned with 3 men willing to take a stand: Samuel, whose hands bore scars from river ropes; Thomas, whose tinkering mind made traps out of scraps; and Grant, whose years as a soldier had carved both discipline and compassion deep into his bones. They came not for coin nor vengeance, but for the idea that a man's home was his own, and that love could be chosen freely even when the world despised it. Ayana welcomed them with simple bread and broth, and her calm presence steadied the room. She had become more than survivor. She was flame and water both, fierce in battle yet gentle in silence, able to remind tired men that the earth could still heal. Calder watched her move among them, speaking little but with eyes that carried weight, and he felt pride bloom in him like a second heart. Their bond had deepened beyond words, each day layering trust upon tenderness until even danger could not shake its root. They prepared for the storm with patient resolve. Trenches dug, walls reinforced, alarms strung tighter. Thomas set small charges in the canyon, clever sparks to rattle horses more than men. Samuel sharpened blades, his voice humming old river songs. Grant drilled them in formations, each movement making farmers into fighters. But when the work ended, evenings glowed soft. Around the fire, Ayana shared stories of her people, her words slow but strong, weaving images of rivers alive with salmon, mountains echoing with children's laughter, stars named for ancestors who still watched. Calder answered with his own memories, not of glory, but of loss, of Helena's defiance at 13, of nights when guilt had nearly crushed him. Each confession became a stone lifted from their chests, each listening a salve laid gently upon scars. And love, which had begun in silence and survival, now grew unashamed. Calder no longer hid his gaze when she moved across the room, and Ayana no longer lowered hers when she met it. They shared laughter that surprised them both, small touches that steadied long hours, kisses that deepened with certainty rather than haste. One night, under a sky heavy with stars, she spoke her heart plainly. "I thought I had died that day on the tree, but love is spirit. Spirit does not die. It only waits." He kissed her then, with the reverence of a man who knew he had been given a second life through another's survival. When Prescott came with his mob, they were ready. The wash exploded with thunder as Thomas's charges fell, stones crashing like judgment, echoes magnified until men swore an army lay hidden in the shadows. Horses screamed and scattered, rifles flashed, but Ayana's arrows cut through fear with grace, each shot steady, each strike a declaration that she would never again be silenced. Calder fought with calm fire, his rifle hot in his hands, his voice steady as he called orders. Their defenders held, though outnumbered, because love and courage had made them one heartbeat. The battle raged until dawn bled over the ridge. When dust cleared, the mob lay broken, pride scattered in the mud. Roosevelt himself rode in with the cavalry, his voice carrying justice where rage had failed. Witnesses came forward, the truth of Coltrane's cruelty revealed, and for the first time Ayana's innocence was spoken aloud by those with power to declare it. Prescott was dragged away, snarling promises of vengeance, but even his voice sounded hollow now, stripped of its following. In the weeks that followed, Peace did not descend all at once, but grew like shoots through ash. Supplies returned to the ranch. Neighbors offered nods that held respect where once had been suspicion. Frank laughed more, Samuel sketched by firelight, Thomas tinkered with new inventions, and Grant spoke quietly of building rather than war. Ayana planted a garden, small but determined, and Calder found himself lingering by her side, watching sprouts push green through hard soil. Healing was slow, but it was real, stitched into every new leaf, every shared meal, every night when love made the scars on their bodies and hearts less heavy. Then spring brought a new miracle. Ayana pressed Calder's hand to her belly one evening, her eyes shining with both fear and joy. "By spring's end," she whispered, "new life." The words struck him deeper than any bullet, gentler than any kiss. Tears filled his eyes as he knelt before her, forehead resting against her, as if in prayer. "Hope," he murmured, already naming what their love had created. "Our child will carry hope." Ayana smiled, her hand threading through his hair, and whispered, "Hope, Ayana Wyatt." Both names, both worlds. Months later, their daughter's cry split the air like sunlight through storm. She was small, fierce, alive, with hair dark as her mother's, and eyes storm-grey like her father's. They named her Hope, and the entire valley seemed to breathe softer. Neighbors came, some still hesitant, but when they saw the child in Ayana's arms and the fierce tenderness in Calder's eyes, something shifted. Walls of hatred did not crumble overnight, but they cracked, and through those cracks light entered. Their home became a place of welcome. Travelers stopped for water and left with stories of healing. Children from nearby ranches came to learn Ayana's songs, while Calder taught them how to mend fences and read the sky. Hope grew surrounded by voices of many tongues, learning to walk on ground once drenched with bitterness, but now seeded with possibility. One evening, as sunset bled rose over the mountains, Calder carved a sign to hang above their gate. He worked the letters with careful patience, each cut an act of defiance against cruelty, each curve an offering to the future. When he hung it, the wood gleamed with oil, the words clear. All are welcome. Love forgives everything. Ayana stood beside him, hope in her arms, her head resting against his shoulder. Together they watched as wind moved through the valley, carrying their promise outward. The desert, which had once seemed barren and merciless, now felt alive with renewal. Coyotes sang not in mourning, but in celebration. Rain clouds gathered like blessings, and stars burned with the certainty that love, once born, could not be killed. Calder and Ayana had faced hatred, had chosen mercy, had built life where others sought only destruction. And now, with their child nestled between them and the horizons stretching wide, they knew they had carved a place of healing, not just for themselves, but for anyone who dared to believe in love stronger than fear. And if this story touched your heart, if you felt the warmth of love rising from ashes, if you saw in their journey a reflection of your own longing for healing and hope, then I invite you to keep walking with us. Like this story, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so these tales of love, courage, and renewal may continue to reach others. Every gesture of support is another spark, another seed of kindness planted in a world that needs it. Together, we can keep the flame alive,